Hello. It's my pleasure to moderate this discussion among experienced practitioners as to how labor and management are confronting and resolving problems at the workplace created by the pandemic. As you've probably already experienced in your own workplace, the pandemic has created issues regarding how employees can be kept safe. It's created issues about needs to change the nature of work and work processes because of various pressures. And today we're going to draw on experiences in particular that have surfaced in the hospitality sector and the utility sector, but they're experiences that I would bet also match a lot of what you're facing wherever you are. Even if you're not in a situation where you have organized labor, I bet the issues we'll discuss are ones that are arising in your workplace. Let me quickly introduce the speakers so we could really get into it. It's my pleasure to first introduce Richard Marocco. Rich is the president of the Hotel Trades Council, an organization affiliated with Unite Here. It's a part of Unite Here, and in that role, he represents over 40,000 employees who work in New York and New Jersey in a wide variety of hospitality-related jobs in hotels and restaurants, casinos, and all. Rich has a law degree. He was a practicing attorney working to defend worker rights and interest, and then he joined Unite Here and became a prominent union leader. It's my then pleasure to turn to Diane LaRocca. Diane is the Executive Director of Labor and Employee Relations for the Public Service Energy Group, a large utility company, Fortune 500 company with over 13,000 employees that serves New Jersey and New York. We often overlook the importance of utilities unless something goes wrong, and to some extent the tragic developments recently in Texas remind us on how important utilities are to our economy and to our well-being. Diane has a law degree from Harvard Law School, and we're proud to also say that she received her undergraduate degree from the ILR School. Our third speaker will be Dan Mcrae. Dan directs the labor relations professional programs at the ILR School housed within the Scheinman Institute. Dan is an experienced negotiator. He led labor relations for a number of large organizations, and then 11 years ago, he joined the ILR School. He too has a law degree, his from NYU. I meant to mention that Rich also has a law degree, not only a practicing attorney. He got his law degree. Let's get all those universities out there from the University of Pennsylvania. Okay, so let's get into it. I've asked Rich to speak first and to give us some examples of some of the problems his workforce has been facing, and also how they've tried to resolve those problems. Throughout today's discussion, we're going to talk not only about problems, but ways in which those problems can be addressed to serve the interests of both labor management and society at large. So, Rich, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Harry. It's a pleasure to be here. So as most people on the call probably know, when the pandemic reached our shores, it reached New York almost first and hit us pretty hard almost immediately. And while it hit the entire city and region fairly hard, it was particularly devastating to the hotel and hospitality industry, where almost immediately we saw mass closures and layoffs of between 80 to 90%, which continue to this day. And it faced, it caused us, meaning both labor and management, to face a fairly unique problem, which is how to deal with this pandemic. And what made it unique was not just the problem that we were facing, but also the fact that our interests in many ways were aligned in ways that they typically are not. Obviously, the union has an interest in protecting the safety and health of our members, as do employers. But also there is or was an important element to restoring the industry, that unless consumer confidence in the safety of hotel rooms and restaurants is able to return, business won't return, which is damaging again to everybody. So with an eye towards both protecting worker safety and health and restoring confidence in the industry, we sat down very early on in March and somewhat blindly tried to come up with some solutions to the dangers caused by COVID-19. And at the time, obviously not much was known either about the disease or how to prevent its spread. So we did the best we could with the information we had, and we were able to negotiate the first of a series of what we call coronavirus safety protocols between the union and the industry. And at the time, those focused really primarily on two factors. The first was transmission based on contact, meaning touch points. And we were able to negotiate, special sanitization teams that would regularly clean public areas with a particular focus on high touch points like elevator buttons with FDA-approved antimicrobial agents. And we had regular cleaning of rooms and things of that nature, which is where we focused in terms of both worker protection, but also consumer confidence. And then also on the ability to use paid time off flexibly for employees who had become ill, who were particularly susceptible, or who had to deal with the other difficulties that we all learned to face during this pandemic, things like childcare and care of a sick relative. What became clear fairly soon was that wasn't going to be enough. So we got back together with the industry and negotiated an addendum and an extension to the safety protocol in June, where we focused on those areas where the science was now pointing as the real danger spots in terms of transmission, which was airborne. So we negotiated terms regarding PPE, the requirement of wearing masks, barriers, HEPA filters and vacuums, things of that nature, and then also took the opportunity to expand on the amount of paid time off that employees could get, both for testing and should they contract the disease. As the pandemic continued to develop and our understanding of it did, so did our agreement. We negotiated another one in August, where we modified and updated those things, and are now currently in the midst of negotiations regarding extending healthcare to make vaccines available even to laid off members, again with an eye towards both, from my perspective, protecting members, but also increasing consumer confidence. So it has been a developing and expanding discussion that we've been having with the industry that, in many ways is kind of more collaborative than we are typically used to, although it still has elements of pushing and pulling on those issues that are high cost items that the union thinks are important that maybe management does not. So in keeping with the short introduction, that is the overview of our of our response to the pandemic.
That's great. Thanks, Rich. I'm going to come back later and have you also chime in about how work has been reorganized. Like in restaurants, there's more takeout and not so much in dining. In hotels, people don't necessarily want to have their rooms cleaned as frequently or have as much direct contact. We'll come back to that matter. Let me also now hear from Diane, get some other examples on the table, and then we'll dig deeper. But that was a great introduction. Diane, it's all yours for us to hear about what's going on in utilities. Again, we often overlook utilities, but it's an absolutely essential sector, and it's really critical to the economy. And I'm interested to hear on how you've been adapting.
Sure, thank you. So as Harry mentioned, we are employees. We have 13,000 of them. About 2/3 of them are union represented. And we have a very collaborative relationship with our unions. We're very lucky in that respect. And when the pandemic struck about over a year ago, this foundation served us well. Since then, we've negotiated over 50 agreements with our unions on topics ranging from paid time off to work practices. And even through some of the challenges that I'll get to in a moment, we remain focused on our common interest. And sometimes we had to refocus on that common interest, which is the health, safety, and well-being of our workers and our customers, as well as continuing to provide our essential service safe, clean, and reliable energy to our 3.5 million customers. So what were some of the challenges? I'll lead with two right now and then happy to talk about more. But at the beginning of the pandemic, we either voluntarily decided or at the direction of the state had to suspend some of our services. So that included closing our customer walk-in centers, suspending any shutoffs or collections for non-payment, and also suspending our non-essential appliance repair work. So the obvious concerns were what happens to the folks performing those functions and the customers receiving those services. So we met with the unions to develop solutions. And one of those solutions is what we call the Worry-Free Tech Talk program. So through that program, any customer who may need a kitchen or laundry appliance repair can place a phone call to one of our technicians who from his or her own home can answer questions, order parts, or walk the customer through the repair step by step. So another example, despite what I said about suspending services, as you can imagine, the majority of our services continued during the pandemic, and many of our workers cannot work remotely. They are out in the field, and many of them enter customer homes. We made the decision to require our employees who enter customer homes to don half-mask respirators before doing so. We met with the unions to explain our decision and reasoning for it to protect the health and safety of our employees, their members, and our customers. The union had some concerns and questions. Most notably, this requirement was new for many of their employees and would require them to undergo and pass a respirator fit test. So as you can imagine, the questions ranged from what happens if these employees can't pass the fit test? What if someone needs an accommodation for a medical reason or a religious reason? How are you going to administer these tests and do so safely during this pandemic? So we met together numerous times and worked through their questions and their concerns. And I'm happy to report that in short order, we were able to fit test over 3,000 of our employees so that we could continue performing our essential services. So I'll leave it at that for now, but again, happy and look forward to the discussion.
That's great, Diane. That was a nice example too. So now let me turn it to Dan Mcrae. Dan teaches in our professional development programs. The whole orientation of those programs is how to teach the parties and work with the parties to develop a problem-solving approach to these kinds of issues. And Dan's going to kind of tell us in basic terms what he teaches the parties and how to accomplish that. It's all yours, Dan.
Sure. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we negotiate, transitioning from what we're negotiating to how we're negotiating. So as Harry said, we want to use negotiations either in a representative environment or non-representative environment, our interactions to promote as much innovation and creativity and problem solving as possible. For reasons I won't waste time, pretty much everyone has bought into that. That's in everyone's organizational statements to promote innovation, collaboration, et cetera. So to think about how the mindset, we were really going to talk about three things about negotiations: the mindset that the parties bring to negotiations, the behavior that they use in the negotiations, and how they structure the negotiations. So mindset, behavior, structure. So obviously we want the parties to have the mindset, a more problem-solving mindset. So what goes into that? Well, if the parties believe that the issues are zero sum in the negotiation, for me to have more, you to have less, means for you to have less, or that I'm trying to persuade you to see it my way, right? That's going to move us away from problem-solving behavior. You can still, make a persuasive case, and you can catch more bees with honey than with vinegar, as our grandmothers suggested, but that's still really, you sort of know what you want, and it's just a matter of persuading the other side. As opposed to a mindset where you're figuring it out. You have a problem that you want to solve, but you're open to the different ways of solving it. And the mindset of negotiation, we're going to figure it out together. I don't necessarily know what the answer is, right? And then finally, whether you're using the negotiation process to improve the ongoing relationship. So it's important for the parties to realize that this isn't the only, Diane said, 50 agreements, right? No one agreement is the whole relationship, right? And you want to use the negotiation process to start practicing certain behaviors that will promote more creativity, create more options, et cetera. So that's the mindset where we're coming in, working with each other. The second piece is the behavior that we use. And so here we're talking really about a rational problem-solving approach, like an interest-based problem-solving approach, where the behaviors we're focusing on more on talking about the underlying problem, the interests, rather than just our one solution. Again, the behavior is not to sell your solution, but to create problem solving within the parties. So you would focus on the interests, and then you would generate options instead of making offers. So you'd have to be in a safe place where you can make crazy suggestions. In fact, a lot of the brainstorming and innovation practice, you would have, the boss would put a crazy idea up on the board, just to get people to start just throwing ideas out. So generating options instead of going straight to the solutions so that we can brainstorm, so we can have creative solutions, right? So I was just looking at Diane's thing about the home tech calls, right? I mean, it's interesting, how did these things, some of these are probably ideas that someone had where you are persuading, and some of them, sometimes you're like, let's figure out a way to do it together, right? And then finally is the structure, right? Generally speaking, we like to debate our point, right? Even if we're doing it nicely, even if I'm trying to persuade you that this is really good for you, and you're such a great person, and you're so handsome, and you should agree with me, all these nice sort of side of persuasion. And of course, we can haggle and do hard bargaining too. There are we just fall into that, right? We fall into sort of arguing our point, debating, and also to become more competitive, right? So if we, bargain over email, you on your side of the table, me on my side of the table, right? There's so many different ways that we can get into that debate and evaluation as opposed to the brainstorm. So the structure of we want to be more structured, right? We want to actually, for problem solving, we want to put people in groups where they're sitting together, where they're working together. It's not an us versus them psychology, even of the shape of the table. And we want to, oddly enough, use flip charts and facilitators. I mean, just whiteboarding ideas, as opposed to I have my notes and you have your notes, and we're sort of doing it more formally. Let's put all the ideas up. So the use of flip charts is a good simple structural way to promote more problem solving. And facilitators, finally, right? Not necessarily outsiders, but sometimes we can get into the debate about what we're talking about. And we need some people, like maybe one person from the union side, one person from the management side, that takes themselves out of the what and just focuses on the how, right? So make sure that people are exploring interests and generating options. If it degenerates into more persuasion or more arguing, those two people can bring them back to the structure of a more problem-solving approach. So that's the basic overview of the mindset, behavior, and structure of negotiations. And Harry, you're up.
Yeah, great. All right. I at this point was going to ask you some of the questions I have, and then encourage the audience to ask questions. But we already have a nice question. I'm going to direct it to Rich. It's asked by someone who's on the hospitality management side. This person is involved in conventions and events, and they're wondering what you or we think regarding the likelihood that they're going to have work again, that there are going to be conventions and events. And as of 2021, is it going to come back in that period? I'm always optimistic, but I'm just curious about it, what an insider like Rich thinks or hears regarding the likelihood that we'll see, conventions and events returning to New York and other places.
Yeah. Well, I like you, Harry, tend to be an optimist about business coming back. In my mind, New York City will always be New York City, and people will always want to come here, both for leisure and for business travel. That being said, I think we have to be realistic about the prospects for when and what business looks like when it finally comes back. And while I do not have a crystal ball, and I have been wrong about several things when it comes to predicting this pandemic, it does seem to me that with the advent of the vaccine, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And depending on, production holdups and distribution issues, certainly I think the conventional wisdom is that we will be reaching a fairly good place, hopefully by the summer. What that means for the return of business, I'm not so certain. I will say in my guess would be that you're going to see leisure travel return more quickly than business travel, because once someone gets the vaccine, they're going to be ready to travel. They're going to want to take advantage of cheap airfare and cheap hotel rates, and they're going to feel cooped up and ready to go and take that dream vacation. So I think you'll see leisure travel and therefore certain leisure-based convention activity, the weddings, the social functions, things of that nature come back first, hopefully followed by business travel. While it remains to be seen when business travel really returns, I have heard the theory, and I think it's a sound one, that with the evolution of what the workplace looks like, now that we've learned and become so adept at using tools like Zoom, that you may have more flexibility in the workplace, you may have more work from home, and something that will fill the gap in terms of interaction and creating those incubators for ideas will be business meetings, conventions, and things of that nature. It certainly makes sense to me, and I hope it is true. When it happens, I don't know, but certainly it is something we're keeping an eye on, because when you're looking, particularly in New York City, RevPAR is driven by business travel, not so much leisure travel. So return of the leisure travel is great for occupancy, and it's great for getting my members back to work. It's really the business travelers and the conventions that are going to put the industry back on a sound financial footing.
Yep. I will say, I do want to ask Diane about the issue about vaccinations and how things are going in your organization about that. But before I do, let me just comment on that question. We have ILR has a large training center. Dan's based there. I work out of there in New York City on Lexington Avenue, and it had been shut down since last March. Our plan is to start having in-person instruction again in the fall. We've been teaching virtually, and we'll continue to offer some virtual options, in part, as Richie just suggested. We've discovered that a lot of people would like to continue operating virtually, especially if they're at a distance from New York City and don't have to come into New York for our training programs. But again, we and Cornell University more broadly are planning on opening up again in the fall, and we hope early fall and all. Anyway, Diane, let me ask you my question about vaccinations. So, how are you dealing with vaccinations? You have some employees who are hesitant to be vaccinated. Are you mandating vaccination? Are you providing, some companies apparently are providing a subsidy for vaccinations? And then if I work in a setting and I learn that not everybody around me is vaccinated, maybe I don't want to interact with that person. So how do you deal with that whole set of questions about vaccinations?
Yeah, so we are not at this time requiring our employees to get vaccinated. However, we are encouraging them to do so. And some of the things that we're doing is, for one, if we have a well-being program, and if you identify yourself as somebody who has gotten vaccinated, there is an incentive under our well-being program that you would be eligible for. We are also, I mentioned a little bit about paid time off. We enhanced our COVID paid time off benefits to provide our employees up to 4 hours per vaccine for themselves, and also to take certain adult family members to get the vaccination. So we recognize, although we're not mandating it, we recognize the vaccine's effectiveness in combating the pandemic. So we're strongly encouraging our folks to do so. Great.
You said you had some other examples too. While you have the mic, why don't you give us another example of a problem or issue that you've faced and how you've dealt with it?
Yeah. So one of the other things I mentioned was at the beginning of the pandemic, we made a decision to close our customer walk-in centers. So this is where folks would usually ask questions, they come and pay bills, et cetera. And so similar to the Worry-Free Tech Talk program, we sat with the unions and we identified how do we continue to keep these folks working. And so ideas went back and forth, but what we decided to do was we had that population work remotely. We cross-trained them to handle some of our email and chat questions and inquiries that came from our customers. We trained them remotely to do that. They got them up and running. And to this day, our customer service centers do remain closed. they are performing those functions, and they're performing them quite well. So we're very proud of that solution that we also came up with the unions.
Great. Another good example. So Dan, I'm curious, Rich mentioned, that health and safety issues are one where there's often a common interest, a joint interest. And in your teaching, how do you deal with the fact when parties say, look, I can deal with, that kind of issue in this kind of interest-based way, but what about other issues that look more conflictual? I just don't think those approaches are working. And yeah, it's nice to talk about it and dream about it, but we just find it difficult to move into that kind of interest-based perspective on issues that seem more conflictual inherently.
Yeah, so I think part of, we've interest-based bargaining and mutual gains bargaining has had a lot of play over the years. And I think the experience is what you've described. And I think part of it is, on our side, we sort of pushed it as a religion. And then people are like, oh, well, if it doesn't work and I'm not, now I'm not doing it. So then I'll just go back to, I'll just go back. I'm not doing it. Doesn't work or not. Whereas recognizing that sometimes, and rather than thinking of it as hard bargaining, sometimes you're just going to try to persuade the other side. You can't be negotiating all the time, right? Particularly in a really detailed way. Sometimes you have to convince and use power, and sometimes you use authority, et cetera. And so the two pieces of advice I would give is don't automatically assume that something is conflictual because it's been conflictual in the past. Money can be conflictual and zero sum. Obviously, it's the most common one. But as Rich was talking, I was thinking we need a multi-stakeholder approach to convince businesses that, you're saving all this money on working from home. You really need to come to New York 3 times a week, three weeks out of the year to ideate, right? It's like no experience, just have this sort of business travel be part of the new mindset. I mean, that's a way in which we can sort of generate more revenue for the employer. So one, don't automatically assume that things are zero sum. I think that's a big part of it, try it out. But if and I can't tell you which are going to be and which aren't going to be, but if you're only using negotiations as an opportunity to persuade, and you're not using a specific problem-solving approach in any of the aspects of your relationship with the employees, then almost by definition, you are missing out then on the opportunities to create value and problem solve more, et cetera. And so the idea is to try to practice it and see where, as parties get more comfortable with using it, maybe they'll find that some of the more conflictual things they have to do a different way, or maybe they'll realize that it doesn't have to be necessarily that way.
Right. And now I have a good question that's come up from the audience that's directed towards Rich and first, and then maybe Diane's had some experience with this too. And the person asks, what's been your experience with using the grievance process over health and safety issues or accommodations for medical concerns? Has that been an effective means to get at some of these issues rather than across the bargaining table or with a memorandum of understanding? So can you tell us a little bit about what you've experienced there?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And back in 2006, we had negotiated some fairly detailed safety and health language into our master collective bargaining agreement, which, while it is detailed in terms of process, is not detailed in terms of safety standards that are set. So there is a general standard which requires that the employer maintain a safe and healthy working environment and proper ventilation, provides the proper equipment, et cetera, but then doesn't go into very much detail about the level of the handrails or things of that nature, but instead creates a process where if there is a dispute between labor and management, there's an ability to bring in a third-party expert, a safety and health consultant, to do an inspection and issue a report, which then either side can challenge. So that was a tool that was available and really became the underpinning of the negotiations. But in terms of our dealing with the COVID crisis as a very specific safety and health hazard, which is what it is, they were primarily dealt with through negotiation because we wanted to have consistent standards that apply across the industry. To Dan's point, look, there was a certain amount of collaboration during those discussions, because again, the pandemic was new, the science was still fairly not so evolved yet. And so while we had infectious disease experts and industrial hygienists that we were consulting with, the industry had some experience too in how to deal with some of these problems. And we were certainly willing to listen to the solutions that they had come up with, particularly if they worked. That being said, a lot of the negotiations were also the more traditional, I guess I'm going to use the term persuasion, which Dan is using, which is kind of a more polite way to describe the type of bargaining that we're accustomed to, which is one side trying to exert power over the other. So, for example, everyone agreed that it would be a good idea to increase the cleaning and the sanitization of guest rooms, for example. It would be important to disinfect touch points, to have certain periods between when a guest left and a room attendant walked in, all these sorts of things, which involve taking more time. And while we could all agree that that was a good thing for protecting the employees, we then got into a dispute about how far to reduce the quota, the amount of rooms that a room attendant would have to clean per day in order to accommodate the fact that there are enhanced cleaning procedures. So it was a combination of collaboration and persuasion. But look, ultimately, we found that we were able to come to a deal that I think provides really superior protection to the employees. So in this case, while the grievance process was the underpinning of those discussions, we really addressed them by having these kind of industry-wide discussions, which were, I think, very useful and gave us a really, in my opinion, great result.
Eric, if I can just piggyback on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Dan. Yep.
Well, it just demonstrates, again, the idea of that you're trying to incorporate problem-solving approaches, but it's not a religion. Sometimes you have to use power, if for no other reason, to get the other side to problem solve with you, right? And so sometimes you use your power. And so the filing of the grievance might be an example where you say, you really want the arbitrator to decide this issue. You're really using it. It's an element of using power, and you want to have the conversation and to problem solve through it. But sometimes the other side, you need to get the other side's attention and give them a reason to do that. So it's why it's not an either or, the more persuasion or using power or problem solve.
Yeah, great. So Diane, what's your experience with using the grievance procedure to address some of the health and safety issues that you've wrestled with?
So more similar to what Rich was mentioning. So we don't have the history of the agreement that Rich was just referred to, but I don't say more proactive approach. So once you have the grievance, usually there's a problem, right? So I think we took a different, I'm trying to be more proactive and get ahead of it through the negotiations rather than waiting for the grievance to come to us, because we most likely or usually are on the receiving end of those grievances rather than filing them ourselves. So similar to what Rich was mentioning, we have our own medical department and health and safety department. So we worked with them in the lines of business and brought the union in to put together various job hazard analyses, right? We already had job hazard analyses for our day-to-day work, but now they needed to be enhanced given the pandemic. So tapping into the expertise that we had in-house as well as across the industry, we worked together to update those analyses, and those are constantly changing as we learn more about the pandemic. And so we kind of tackled it that way. There are very, very few grievances that have been filed with respect to the health and safety protocols.
Great. So there's a couple of questions, Diane, I wanted to relay to you. One was a question asked, and I'll come back and ask Rich how he's wrestled with this. And the question was, what kinds of communication strategies did you have to adopt to stay in touch with, in particular, the field staff? I guess with the notion that they're sort of less closely integrated in the organization, maybe. And did you need new communication strategies over these kind of COVID health-related issues? And the second question, just while I have the mic, is someone would like to hear a little bit more about the well-being incentive that you mentioned that you use for vaccinations. Could you clarify a little bit about that too?
Sure. So maybe I'll take the second one first, because I think that one might be a little bit quicker. So we have a well-being program through which you can earn points and incentives and cash for doing various health activities. So, walking X number of steps a quarter gets you, for example, a discount on the premium that you pay every month for your health insurance. So we built off that platform and are giving employees certain points that can be used, cashed in for, I think they're gift certificates and other items. I'm not quite sure what they all are, but they get points and they can use those points and put them towards whatever they want. And that's kind of how we're handling that. Again, they need to represent and inform us that they've been vaccinated, and they do that on the honor system. But once they've done that, it's built into our already existing well-being program. As far as the communication with the employees, so we did beef up our communication strategy, and we actually, I guess one of the silver linings through this pandemic, other than Zoom and remote work for some of us who are lucky enough to be able to do it, we were able to, I'm looking at my phone, but we pushed out an app that easily all of our employees can download on their phones, and they can get daily communications, weekly communications. Everything is pushed out through that app, not only through email. And for many of our field workers, they continue to have their morning huddles with their supervisors. So any messages that need to get out into the field, not only do we have, now an enhanced platform through this app, but their supervisors or managers are having these huddles with them on a daily basis to communicate with them. And I guess the other thing I would say is just as far as the unions are concerned, when March struck, and we have 8 unions who represent our workers. We had, I think it began as daily meetings, just providing updates, and then that went to maybe every other day, and still today, once or twice a week, we're formally meeting with the unions just to see how things are going, and if we have, an agenda item that we need to talk about to walk through those. But the communication has been essential. And, we started out, we didn't even have Zoom when we started out as a company kind of accepted platform to conduct business over. And so, again, similar to the app, the pandemic has allowed these various communication channels to take over, and so far, so good.
So, Rich, as you mentioned right at the start, this has been a massive downturn in hospitality. And so, I once heard a number that detail, or the president of Unite Here mentioned that at one point, this was, I think, late last spring, 95% of your members within Unite Here broadly were laid off. And so how did you communicate with your members, both because so many of them were laid off and there were so many critical issues and so much uncertainty and fear and trepidation about not only the layoffs, but, whether they be recalled or not, or, what the environment would be when if they came back to work? What evolved within the union regarding communication with its members?
No, it's a great question, because, the pandemic forced us kicking and screaming into the 21st century. Historically, our communication with our members was the old school. A business representative would go into the hotel, they gather workers, delegates, shop stewards around, and tell them what's going on. And that was the way we communicated most often. That's the way we gave information to our members. That's the way we received it from them. That's the way we did contract ratifications, things of that nature. And obviously, all of that became impossible last year. So we, like everybody else, started adopting platforms like Zoom to communicate with our members. But one of the things that I'm really proud of is our ability to pivot the way we communicate with our members, which has resulted in really our developing relationships with a much broader range of members than we ever have before. And that's largely by adopting tools like mass text blasts, updating and really bringing our website miles from where it was in terms of both usability and the ability to provide information. Figuring out how to do meetings telephonically where people can vote by pressing 1 or 2 on their phone. And as a result of that, we've really broadened the number of members that we're in regular communication with. And then layered on top of that, our business agents were working throughout the pandemic, and they were on the phone almost constantly, both giving members updates as to the state of the industry generally, but also giving them updates on our efforts to win continued health care or win bridge payments, which are kind of severance pay paid out over time that doesn't waive recall rights. But also kind of keeping them up to date on, for example, their options when it comes to finding alternate health care if they need it. Just giving medical information or really just, communicating with them and reassuring them that, when the industry finally recovers and when the tourists come back to New York, that their jobs will be secure because the union contract protects them. So in a way that was really encouraging to me, I think the union's relationship with our members has both broadened and deepened.
Interesting. So I've got a question. I'm going to first direct it to Dan, but then I'll see if Diane and Rich have things to add. This person is concerned about how to deal with the fact that there may be new skills required, given that work and work processes have changed because of the COVID. And I guess the question for Dan is, how do you ensure that training questions and skill needs are dealt with in an interest-based way? How do you promote the common interest around training, where it could easily fall into a distributive question with the labor side saying, we want our current workers to do it, and we're just offended that you're even thinking of going to the outside for training needs. How do you make that a win-win issue?
Well, sure, we can look at it in a positive some way, that it's good for the workers and good for the company, for everyone to improve their skills. But again, there's no reason why you can't treat it in the same sort of process, where you dig deeper into the interests of each side. What is it that the workforce is really, or the union is really concerned with, right? What practically are the problems with what the employer wants? What does the employer want? Where do they want it? Where, getting more data, digging deeper into the nature of the problem, and then generating different options that potentially could meet both sides. You can always resort to more hard bargaining and or use of power, but you may be surprised that you're finding more win-win opportunities. And certainly that example wouldn't be one that my mind would automatically go to a zero sum, like price, like wages or something. I don't know what the other folks think.
Yeah. Rich, I know in hospitality, I've heard there's discussion about as guests are coming back, and let's hope come back even sooner than later. There's questions about how the workforce is going to be deployed. Not all guests want to be greeted anymore by someone at the front desk. Maybe they'd rather do an automatic checkoff, or not all guests want their room cleaned as frequently, or maybe there's changes as well in other aspects of the hotel, or you could think of similar issues in a restaurant. Have you begun to wrestle with those kinds of questions as work has begun to return, and as people are returning to in-place dining or returning to hotels? Are there, and how are you finding solutions where you make use of the existing employees rather than think about going to hire somebody else when there's a shift in the need?
Yeah, I mean, that is certainly something that will become more of an issue in hopefully the near term as the industry really starts to recover. We haven't seen a lot of that yet, but we've been dealing with some of the issues that were around pre-pandemic and that were starting to take hold that were accelerated as a result of COVID. So to use an example that you raised, automatic check-in. Keyless check-in, where a guest is able to simply download their key onto their smartphone and open the door to their room without ever interacting with someone at the front desk. And that was a technology that predated the pandemic. Obviously, a lot of people started to look at it more carefully during and now because it limits interaction. So while I don't think that there's going to be a tsunami towards keyless entry, we were able to negotiate agreements that the front desk staff were trained to do all of the data entry that was required to use the keyless entry system, and guarantee that no one was going to be laid off as a result, and the bargaining unit wouldn't be reduced by attrition. So we were able to negotiate something that protected work and protected workers while allowing this new technology to be implemented.
Good example, Diane. So I would assume as there's been more virtual work, you've also faced some training needs or repositioning some of your employees. How have you wrestled with that?
So for our workers who I had mentioned, that worked in the customer walk-in centers and even these folks in the Tech Talk program, we were able to push that training out virtually to them, right? So we gave them the computers and what they needed, and they needed to attend the training, and then they did so remotely. The one area that we are working through, though, as a direct result of the pandemic is, let's take a line worker. To become a line worker, that's a 3-year, for us, it's a 3-year training program. Part of that is, classroom, which we can facilitate virtually, but some of that is, climbing a pole. And so one challenge that we've faced is because we cannot have as many folks, together training at the same time, our classes aren't as large, the training has slowed down, right? So we're being deliberate at keeping health and safety at the forefront, training folks in a manner, but it has slowed down the training program. So that's something that we need to, if this pandemic is going to be around, is already around longer than I think any of us anticipated when I know I left my office in March. It's something that we're going to continue to challenge. How are we going to get folks trained so we have that they're ready to perform their functions for our customers? Yeah.
So there's about 10 minutes left in our time, and I just wanted to see for either of you whether there's issues we haven't yet touched on that you think are either good examples of problems that you've wrestled with or other issues being brought to the fore by the pandemic, even if you don't have a solution for it, what some of the issues are. I just want to see if we've missed our coverage of something that's really been important to you.
Well, I could take a shot at that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Obviously, from my perspective, and my perspective is I represent workers in the hotel industry, the vast majority of whom have been without work for close to a year now. And that they're not out of work because they're unwilling to work or they're not motivated to work. The contrary is true. There's no work for them because there's no business, and there's no business, there are no jobs for them to return to, which means that through no fault of their own, they find themselves without the income and the health insurance that are provided through the job. And that has been the problem that has given us the most consternation, and for obvious reasons. From the union's perspective, what could be more critical than keeping laid off employees covered by health insurance than when you're in the midst of a pandemic? And that is something that we fought very hard on behalf of our members. And we did that through arbitration and through negotiation. And we're able to extend health care for our members through the entirety of 2020, notwithstanding the fact that they weren't working. And that was a very difficult thing to accomplish, because remember, we're getting funding for this healthcare from an industry that has virtually no revenue. So, between healthcare and then obviously getting supplements to our workers in terms of revenue, particularly after the federal supplement to unemployment ran out, that became critical. And, again, through a series of arbitrations and contract provisions regarding severance pay, we were able to get our members extra supplementary income to bridge the gap between unemployment and what they really needed to survive. But what's crystal clear is that in the end, there is only so much blood you can get from a stone. And it does absolutely require government intervention, both in terms of continued healthcare or healthcare subsidies, in terms of wage supplements or unemployment supplements for those who need it. And that is something where we will be transitioning, hopefully, from the typical adversarial, I'm going to extract this from the industry, into something where our interests are completely aligned, and we'll be able to approach, and we have been approaching politicians and appealing to them to help us make sure that our members are protected and that the industry can recover when the pandemic starts to subside. So that, to me, has been what's been all-consuming for 2020, and it looks like it will be all-consuming for at least the first couple of quarters of 2021.
Yeah, I was about to ask about that. Are there joint interests in terms of the public policy? It's good you raised it. I do want to continue with Rich, and then I'll go back to Diane and see if she as well faces these common interests that are emerging between the company and its workforce, since utilities are also regulated and employees have often a similar interest to management. But Rich, this issue of immigration that's coming to the fore, we begin to hear talk of whether the Biden administration is going to offer a kind of a big comprehensive immigration bill or piecemeal immigration reform. The hospitality sector relies heavily on immigrant labor, and yet it's an issue where, as you were just talking about, there are many common interests between the union and the management side. Do you find yourself beginning to further or getting involved in discussions with your management counterparts on immigration where it's the common interests that are emerging and are dominating?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're, right now, obviously, our focus is on things like healthcare and wage supplements, vaccination, travel restrictions. Those things are at the forefront. But underlying that is always what I believe is the common interest in immigration reform. You're absolutely right that the hospitality industry employs a large number of immigrants. They are a vibrant part of the industry and our communities and our membership. And our interests are aligned in making sure that they are protected. And that is something that we can go so far in terms of a contract, and we've gone pretty far and have really avant-garde language protecting immigrants in a variety of different ways in our contract. But you always run up against the brick wall of the law. The law says you can only go this far and no farther. And when it comes to moving that wall back in a way that is equitable and just towards immigrants, I think we do have a common interest.
So Diane, what about you? It may or may not be immigration. It may be, regulatory policy on utilities or other matters. Do you find that there are public policy issues where the management and labor side actually have more in common rather than in opposition, and find themselves kind of jointly lobbying or carrying out joint information campaigns or of that sort?
Yeah. So outside of COVID, we, through the government, we try to lobby for programs like we call Energy Strong, GSMP. We have a nuclear plant down in southern New Jersey. So again, looking at our common interest of continuing to provide services and provide this clean, safe, and reliable energy, we will work with the unions. The unions will support us because it's in their interest to get more work or not see our nuclear plant close. And it's in our interest as well. So on those types of policy matters, we do work together because our common interests there overlap. With respect to the pandemic, I would say what we're going through right now is about vaccinations. So, I think we had expected that, given the essential nature of the work that we provide, that perhaps we would have been in that 1B category, and we are in the 1C category. So how do we go about partnering with our unions and other folks to possibly change that prioritization? If we're unable to change that prioritization, again, not skipping the line in front of other folks, but if we can't change the prioritization, how do we get the supply? Because right now we do have many employees, again, who are out there every day in the field entering folks' homes. They do want to be vaccinated. Is there a way to get the supply to our workers so that they can do so and continue their jobs safely. So that's kind of what we're focusing on right now. And we'll see.
Yeah, in a way you could say both the utility industry and hospitality have a good argument that their employees are essential. There's always a lot of attention to school teachers and healthcare providers. Those are obviously really important people, that are operating the transportation system. But you could well argue that utility and hospitality are essential industries, and their employees are doing essential things. So, Dan, when you're teaching people about how to engage in negotiations, how does this issue come up, in dimensions like public policy, where parties don't normally integrate it closely into the contractual bargaining or work rules, but yet it's an issue, and where there are, as we just heard, there often are a lot of common interests.
Yeah, well, when you were talking about immigration and available supply of labor, the thing that was triggered for me is, in the last 10 years, providing technical assistance and education, almost every single employer has complained on some level about the lack of workers that they can get. The exceptions, there's some companies that have really robust internal training programs, like maybe one out of the 150 organizations I've worked with over the last 8 to 10 years has said, no, we're good. But pretty much everyone, and that's before COVID. And so not only the whether Biden's going big or small in immigration, also what's coming down the pipe is an infrastructure bill. So imagine, with an extra $2 trillion, we wouldn't have, I think there's a general consensus, we don't have the workforce in order to spend $2 trillion in infrastructure. So I think a lot of these issues are going to, whether it's immigration, it's more attention to training and developing the workforce. I think there are probably many different aspects to it, but that, certainly that's something, it's the same sort of process, just more parties, more interests, and having a process where we can promote creativity and problem solving for some of these questions.
Rich, I've seen stories begin to surface about with the idea that, look, the hospitality industry has been clobbered so deeply, as you reminded us, that there are employees who are now leaving it as a sector. They've sort of given up on it, and they're moving to other sectors, other industries, and I would assume part of your challenge in communicating with your members is to stay in touch with them, because you're negotiating these benefits and you're keeping them informed. How do you deal with this issue that some employees are kind of getting disillusioned with the possibility of returning to hospitality? And there as well, it seems like you also have a common interest with management. Management wants to retain those skills rather than 6 months from now, when hopefully things are picking up again, that they don't have the employee base to meet their needs.
Yeah, no, look, certainly our members would like to return to work, and one of the reasons is, the wages and benefits that are provided by a hotel job under our contract are legitimately middle class jobs with decent wages and free family health care and defined benefit pension plan. So it is a job worth waiting for, and because our contract provides for recall rights without limitation, when the business comes back, our members will come back too. So absolutely, the vast majority of them are just waiting for the day that they can go back to work, and very anxious to do so. And what we've been working on is, making sure that during this interim period, they have healthcare and they have kind of the supplementary income that they need in order to pay the bills. And then to Diane's point, we have been working very hard with the industry to ensure that they are properly classified as essential workers who are deserving of the vaccine. Hotel workers, in New York, high-risk travelers are required by the state to quarantine. And where are they going to quarantine? In hotels, which means that hotel workers are, in a very real sense, frontline workers when it comes to dealing with high-risk populations, whether that be, quarantined travelers, oftentimes medical professionals who are coming here to deal with the pandemic, sometimes at-risk populations like homeless populations, things of that nature. So obviously, once the vaccine is there, that will make it much easier and make our members much more willing to return to work, feeling they can do so safely. So that is something that we are working on very hard too.
So we only have about 30 seconds. Anyone want to make any last comments or interjections, something critical that we just haven't touched on? All right, that's great. So we've had a lot of good questions from the audience. They've stayed with us. You've given us lots of good examples. I want to remind the audience, if they're interested in pursuing some training in this area. As I mentioned, this is what Dan does for a living. He directs our professional development programs in labor relations. We teach those programs now virtually, and we hope at some point in the fall to return to in-person. We're most likely going to have a mix of in-person and virtual teaching, since a number of parties have told us they, as Diane suggested, we've discovered Zoom, and they like to be taught in a way that doesn't require that they leave their home or their office. So you can find those programs by looking at the website at the ILR School, the Scheinman Institute Professional Development Labor Relations Programs. Those are have now been posted in the chat. You can also see that website there. And then if you have any troubles after looking at the website or difficulty finding it, you can be in touch with Dan or me. We'd be happy to help you out. So let me again.
Wait for educational tourism to return, Rich, to New York. Bring all the businesses in here, stay in the hotels, use the electricity in New Jersey, you know.
Well, bring them in. They're going to use, that's right, they're going to use electricity provided by Diane's program, and they're going to stay at hotels and eat at restaurants serviced by Rich's employees. Absolutely. We're all in this together. So thank you, Diane, Rich, and Dan. It's been a pleasure talking about these issues with you, and take care.
Thank you.